Right, it's 9 o'clock. We're going to start the Q&A session. If there's anybody who have any questions, please feel free to type in your questions into the link, into the comment box, and I will respond to your questions. I'll just wait for your questions to come. Yeah, I think you can just type. If I'm not wrong, you can just type the comments, right? Should be that. I see some comments already written here. So anybody got any questions whatsoever, please feel free to begin. Can you explain the subsidy and the tax graph? Ray Xuan, can I check with you? Are you referring to the demand supply chapter, or are you referring to the externalities tax and subsidy? While waiting for your response, I'll just start off by explaining the demand supply model. So if you have what we call an indirect tax, for example, right? So indirect tax will be levied upon sellers. Right, so if you levy an indirect tax on seller using a demand supply framework, so vertical axis price, horizontal axis quantity of some good sold per week. Then what an indirect tax will do is typically cause the supply curve to shift upwards by a vertical distance equal to the tax per unit. So the vertical shift upwards is equal to the tax per unit. Is this a parallel shift? Or a non-parallel shift? Then that depends on whether we have a specific tax or an ad valorem tax. Right, so if it's a specific tax, then we will have a parallel upward shift, so S0 to S1. If it's an ad valorem tax, which is a percentage tax, then you have a non-parallel shift. So all right, so this will be how an indirect tax will work. So coming back to address Ray Xuan's question first. Isabel, I'll come to your question in a moment. All right, so Rachel is asking the tax graph. So when you have imposed a tax, let's say we do a indirect specific tax. So indirect specific tax. So the graph shifts up by the vertical distance equals to the tax per unit. So what will happen is that the market equilibrium, original equilibrium E0, at this original quantity, original price rather, quantity demanded, already supply will have decreased to Q0 prime, resulting in a shortage. This shortage will exert an upward pressure on the price, which will cause a market adjustment process to get us to new equilibrium E1, where the price has increased to P1 and the quantity has fallen to Q1. Okay, so the important thing to note is that the increase in price here, delta P, is actually smaller than the tax, right? Smaller than the tax increase. So this tells us that the firm is able to pass on part of the tax to the consumer in terms of higher price, but they will not be able to pass on fully. Now, what will determine whether the firm is able to pass on more or less? Then it depends on things like price elasticity or demand. For instance, right, if I draw a text like this, now look at what I'm doing on the screen. Right? I'm going to clone this graph. So this is the exact duplicate of the same graph. Now, if I were to draw a price elastic demand versus a price inelastic demand, note that the tax increase is exactly the same for these two graphs, but the price increase will be different, right? The price increase is a lot bigger for the demand that is price inelastic, and the price increase is a lot smaller for the demand that is price elastic. So then this shows the different extent to which the firm can pass on the higher taxes to the consumers in terms of higher prices. So this is the tax diagram. Now, conversely, right, if we were to look at an indirect subsidy, a subsidy that is indirect is given to the seller. So what it does is it lowers the cost of production for firms. That will shift the supply curve vertically downwards by a distance equals to the subsidy per unit. Because of this, the equilibrium point moves from E0 to E1 through a market adjustment process, and the price will ultimately fall and quantity increase. The fall in price, however, again is smaller in magnitude than the fall in the subsidy given, suggesting that the firm can only pass on part of the cost saving, part of the lower cost to the consumers in terms of lower prices. Right, so Rachel, this is the information. This is my answer to your question to explain the tax and subsidy graph. If it's not sufficient, please follow up with more specific questions. I'll continue to go into detail for you. All right, so now let's move on to Isabel. Wait, that was my cursor. So Isabel asked, what kind of questions can combine demand, supply, and market failure? Actually quite difficult, right? Quite difficult to combine demand and supply and market failure. So my suspicion, right, is that instead of testing demand and supply, they might test what we call rational decision making, right? So what the examiner might test, instead of DDSS, they might test rational decision making. An example of this question could be, explain how rational consumers decide whether or not to buy a good. And so there's a second part to this question, how producers determine the level of production. So one of the possible questions the examiner could test is about rational decision making for part A. So instead of a demand supply, it is like the more foundational understanding underneath demand supply, which is marginalist principle. Then the part B of this question could ask you like, does the market always, does rational decision making by economic agents always result in an efficient allocation of resources? Then in which case the part B, you can say how the presence of market failures such as externalities, right, can cause rational decisions to lead to market failure or to inefficient outcomes, right? So if, for example, this was the case, suppose this was the case, to ask you how rational consumers decide whether or not to buy a good. So we split this question into first part, right? How rational consumers decide whether or not to buy a good, and how producers, we call this part one, and we call this part two of this part A question. So part one, how rational consumers decide to buy a good. To answer this question, so you first have to begin with the concept of like what is rationality. Then after that, you have to answer the question is how consumers make decisions. So for instance, for rationality, you might present the idea that a rational consumer is one who uses all information at his or her disposal to consistently and predictably make decisions that are congruent to his or her goals. Right, so there's a statement of the statement of the concept of rationality. A rational consumer is one who uses all information at your disposal. So I emphasize information at his or her disposal doesn't have to be perfect information. That means the consumer can actually get the information wrong, right, but still be rational. And this consumer will consistently and predictably make decisions that are congruent to their objectives. All right, so then from there, once you have defined rationality, then you need to explain the rational decision making. So consumers, the decision making framework of consumers, also of producers, is known as the marginalist principle, which states that a rational consumer whose goal is to maximize utility will consume a good up to and including the unit where MPB is equal to MPC. So this is the statement of the marginalist principle. So once you define rationality, you claim that the consumer's decision making is based on marginalist principle, you state the marginalist principle, then you go on to explain the process whereby the examiner make decision. Now, I'm going to move to the next screen, but if you later want to go back to what we have written here, please feel free to go back, use the time bar, right, to come back to this screen. So now check the time on the video so that later can find it easily. All right, so what you do next, right, is to contextualize in an example of a good, right? So for example, you want to put a good such as bicycles, right? So you follow the Cambridge exam question in the past. So what you do is you draw a benefit cost diagram. So benefits of buying bicycle and cost of buying bicycle. So number of bicycles bought. So how does a consumer rationally decide to buy a bicycle? So for a consumer who would rationally buy a bicycle, this consumer would have an MPB and an MPC that intersects at a point where there is a positive value. So we call this value QP, or private optimum. Right? So QP is private optimum. So if the private optimum is a positive number, then that shows us that the consumer will buy a bicycle. But that's just a claim. How then do you explain that this is true? So to do so, you're going to compare with 0. What if the consumer chooses not to buy versus if the consumer chooses to buy? So from here, what you can do is you mark out these 3 points on the graph. Let's call these points A, B, and C. And then you say that area O, B, C, Q, P. Now where is this area? O, B, C, Q, P. This is area under MPB, right? So this will be the increase in total benefits, total private benefits of buying a bicycle, right? Of buying a bicycle. Now you contrast this with area O, A, C, Q, P. So area OACQP would be this area here, this area under the MPC curve. This would be the increase in total private cost. So you can see from this graph, then quite obviously, right, that there is a net gain to the consumer of area ABC. So with a net gain of area ABC shown in the graph, we can now immediately see that the consumer becomes better off by buying a bicycle. So this graph not only do you use the marginalist principle to explain, not only use the marginalist principle to state how the decision is made, you use a graph, right, to show how the consumer would, if MPB, MPC intersects at QP, which is a positive number, the consumer will buy. But you explain why that makes sense by showing that moving from 0 to QP, the increase in benefit is greater than the increase in cost, resulting in a net gain to the consumer. So this is a graph to show a consumer will rationally choose to buy a bicycle. But that's not the entire answer to the first part. So part 1 is whether or not to buy. So you need to show how a consumer might sometimes choose not to buy. So diagram to show a rational consumer choosing not to buy a bicycle. So this diagram, so I write benefits and costs in shorthand. So in order to show that the consumer would rather not buy, then you would draw the MPB, MPC either intersecting at 0 units, so QP equals to 0, or they don't even intersect at all. Now, then in order to, so this shows that the consumer's private optimum is not to buy. But to show that this actually makes sense, right, then you just arbitrarily choose a quantity that is positive, and then you mark out the triangle here called ABC, and then you explain how area OACQP, which is this area, is the increase in total benefits, and show that this area is actually smaller than OABQP. So this area, OABQP, is increase in total cost to the consumer. Then the consumer is actually becoming worse off, so experiencing a net loss to consumer welfare. So suggesting that the consumer is worse off by choosing to consume at this quantity. Right, so then this graph explains to us how a consumer, the rational consumer, sometimes some consumers would rationally choose not to buy, and some consumers would choose rationally to buy. So this would be the diagram for to buy. This would be a diagram for don't buy, right? So this explains the first part of the question, which is how rational consumers decide whether or not to buy. So now come to the second part of the question, how producers determine the level of production. Producers determine the level of production means we are assuming the producer will produce the good. So there's no question of do or don't do it. Now it's a question of produce or don't produce. The question is how much to produce. So the marginal private benefit of producer is the marginal revenue. The marginal private cost to the producer is the marginal cost of production. According to marginalist principle, the producers will produce at this QP. This QP is known as your profit maximizing output. So based on marginalist principle, we can claim that this is a profit maximizing output. To prove that this is a profit max output, we need to show that at any output lower than QP, the firm has a lower profit. And at any level of output higher than QP, the firm also has less profits. So to do so, you add in the two quantities below and above, and you mark out the 5 points on this graph for area A, B, C, and then area C, D, E. So on the left-hand side, to conclude that the firm is actually better off, so you compare area Q0 BC QP versus area Q0 AC QP. So where is Q0 BC QP? Q0 BC QP versus area Q0 AC QP to show that there's a net gain to the firm if they move from Q0 to QP. But then going on the right side, if you compare area QP CE Q1 versus area QP CD Q1, so area QP CE Q1 is the benefit to the firm, revenue increase, and the cost increase to the firm is QP CD Q1. Then you find that the firm will actually end up having more cost than revenue increase. So CDE becomes the decrease in profit. So then this proves that the firm is better off at QP in terms of profit compared to Q0 or QP1. So this explains why the firm becomes, the firms will decide to produce at QP. So this will be one of the ways that the examiner could test you as a part A question in terms of how the decision making is done. Now, so going back to Isabel's question, right? So what kind of question can combine demand and supply and market failure? I really haven't seen at A level a question that does that before. So I really cannot predict exactly how they will do. So it's kind of weird to merge the two topics together. So the closest I can imagine is this. All right. If you got any other questions, please feel free to just type in. I'll answer all your questions. Hi, Justin. Is it possible that part A is demand supply and part B is a market failure policy? I guess it's possible. So just that the flow wouldn't be a typical question, because normally when you have a policy question in part B, right, is to address some problem that part A will ask you to explain. Right? Part A will ask you to explain the problem that the market is facing before you have to talk about the policy. So I'm also I find it rather weird unless the school teacher just purposely, right, want to set the two questions A and B in two different chapters for the sake of testing a wider range of topics. Otherwise, A and B won't flow. But is it possible? Sure. Then if they do a part A question, demand supply question, then it will be either testing you on causes of event question or effects of event question, attribute question, or usefulness of concept question. If they test demand supply, I'm confident to predict for you it's going to be either a causes of event or effects of event. Okay, I tell you what, while waiting for your question, let me take this chance to recap with you a policy question. So if you since you told me that your school is going to test the market failure for externalities, right? Then if it's an externalities question, if it's a part B, and the question, let's say, test on policy, right? Then this should be what we call a 2-to-1 policy question. What does 2-to-1 mean? 2-to-1 means two policies to address one problem. So then you contextualize, right? Contextualize, let's say negative externalities. So for instance, for negative externalities, what you might do is to say, example, cigarettes. So what policy can you choose? So let's draw the negative externality first for cigarettes. So you have MPB equals to MSB. So we assume that there's no positive externality to consumption of cigarettes. Then MPC is the private cost to the consumer, and you have a marginal social cost that is higher, indicating that it's external cost, MPC. So private optimum, QP, is higher than social optimum, QS, resulting in a deadweight loss equals to area ABC. Now then, what are your policies that you can choose? So policy 1 would be taxes, right? So, or rather more specifically, indirect taxes. So if you use indirect taxes, then what this could do is to lower the, or rather increase the marginal private cost to the consumer, pushing the MPC up to MPC 1, which is equal to the MSC. Then you bring your market from point C to point A, lowering the private optimum QP to QP prime. So this would be one policy you can use. So in terms of the essay structure, if it's a 2-to-1 policy, so part B can be split into R1 and R2. R1 will be to discuss policy 1, while R2 is to discuss policy 2. So in R1, you have what we call a thesis argument and an antithesis argument, followed by a, wrong color. Thesis argument, antithesis, T1 and A1, followed by IEV1, so interim evaluation 1. So thesis 1 will be explain how the policy works. Antithesis 1 will be explain a limitation of the policy. Then EV would be to IEV will be evaluate whether the policy works well or not. All right, so this would be the way you structure the first policy. Then you repeat for second policy before you go to what we call overall evaluation to determine which policy works better. So you have T2A2, IEV2. All right, I got a question popping in. So now let me address that question first. So Natasha asked, how does direct provision work? There are two ways to consider direct provision. The first part of direct provision is in addressing what is called public goods, right? So public goods is a good in which when left to the free market, there will be complete non-provision of the good, meaning that this good there will be in the free market, no resources would have been directed to the production of the public good. Therefore, it's a form of allocative inefficiency and a market failure. Direct provision is when the government of a country take it upon itself to produce the good or to pay for the good to be produced. So, for example, when the government of a country directly provides national defense, this is when the government of a country directly get involved in the production of national defense, so setting up the armed forces, buying the machinery and the equipment, the tanks and the helicopters, etc. Right? So all this will be direct provision. So government pay for it and government produces defense. However, direct provision can also be in the form of the government paying for the provision of the public good that is produced by some private firm. For example, we don't have a ministry of street lamps, right, in this country or in any country for that matter. So the government of a country pays money to private companies to build and install and maintain street lighting in the country, right, as a public good. So this direct provision therefore can be government pay for something to be done by a private firm, or the government pay for it and produce it. So produce or not become less important in the idea of direct provision. It is the idea of paying for it. Now, how does direct provision solve public good problem? Direct provision solve public good problem because public goods main problem is that there is a missing payer, right? The missing market due to missing demand is not because nobody wants the good, but it's nobody wants to be the one to pay for the good. So it's not nobody wants to consume the public good, just nobody wants to be the one paying. So the government's direct provision, where they come in and pay for it, is the direct solution to the missing payer problem. So that's how it solves. Now, but because your school is testing externality as the market failure, or according to the information you give me, your school is testing externalities, then this direct provision shouldn't be talking about the public goods direct provision. So maybe we are talking about positive consumption externality, where a certain good, right, if left to the free market, would be under consumed. So for instance, if a good, if left to the free market, is under consumed, so you might have MPB much lower than MSB, and MPC is equal to MSC. So this would be a case of QP less than QS. So that's called underconsumption, and this results in a deadweight loss area equals to this. Now, how to interpret direct provision here? It's a little bit more awkward. So if you think of direct provision as government pay for it, right? Then I would think of it as government pay for it means government set a price to be zero. So if we interpret direct provision, if we interpret as government setting the price at $0, right, means the government pay for the good to be produced, then what the government wants to do, right, is to get P equals to 0 price set here, so consumers will consume up to this point. Now, in order to show that this is the solution to market failure, right, what I need to do is to, now a bit complicated, right? I draw a MPC, MSC. I want to claim that this quantity is QS, social optimum. Now, to claim that it is social optimum, I need to draw an MSB graph so high that MSB-MSC intersection gives me QS. That means social optimum occur when everybody consumes the good. Then how do we get everybody consume the good? By the government setting price equals to 0. So you can think of this as a solution. So government setting price equals to 0 to get everybody to consume the good. So that could be one way you can explain direct provision of a good with very, very significant externality. So for example, you might look at COVID vaccine, for example, how the Singapore government made COVID vaccine available for $0, right, during the pandemic, and even after the pandemic, they made the price 0, not because it's a public good, but because the externalities are so significant. Now, take note that direct provision, again, don't have to be the government produce the vaccine. The Singapore government or any government for the matter didn't get involved in the making of the vaccine. It was pharmaceutical companies to do so. What the government simply does, right, is to pay for the vaccines to be bought, right? And then the government distributed the vaccines at zero prices. So to the consumer, out-of-pocket cost is zero. Right? So the government simply be the payer of this. So that can be how you can use direct provision to deal with positive externality. Now, then you might say, okay, suppose this was a policy, this was the policy I want to present in my essay. What can be an alternative policy? An alternative policy that you might want to present is government to make it compulsory. So use legislation to make it compulsory for everybody to consume the good. Because when you subsidize to a zero price, right, maybe some people still don't want to consume. Right? At $0, some people might choose not to consume the good anyway. So in this case, then your making compulsory might be more effective. All right, so Isabel had a follow-up question. Can I explain subsidies versus direct provision for Part B? It's not a good idea to use subsidy versus direct provision if it's a positive externality, right? Direct provision already means the government is the one paying for it. Subsidy is the government paying for it, just to a different degree only. So you are subsidizing, so direct provision is full subsidy, right? Then if you say subsidy, probably means you are giving partial subsidy. The extent is different only. So not a very good choice to compare subsidy versus direct provision. Once you understand that direct provision involves the government subsidizing the consumption of the good to the point where the price to the consumer is zero. So therefore, legislation, right, is a better argument here in terms of, let's say, making compulsory. So go back to vaccines, right? So you can make vaccines compulsory or you can make vaccines free, right? Making vaccine free is direct provision, but it is also therefore a subsidy, right? So you subsidize it to the point where it's free, it's called direct provision. So don't get this wrong idea that direct provision means the government is the one making the good, and the government don't have to be the one making the good. Right, the government like for example, your parents provide for you. Your parents provide for you in terms of food, right, and accommodation. Your parents don't grow their own food. Your parents don't build their own house, right? They pay for things to be bought, right, so that you can enjoy housing, you can enjoy food, you can enjoy electricity with air conditioning, you can enjoy Wi-Fi. Your parents don't make any of this. They provide for it by paying for it. So government direct provision is about paying for it. Whether or not they produce matters very little. All right, so to answer Isabel's question, no, you shouldn't compare subsidies with free direct provision, because free direct provision is subsidy. All right, so Natasha, I hope that I also answered your question on how direct provision works. So there are two ways I summarize, Natasha. Direct provision can work in terms of public goods, can be, or in terms of positive externalities. But positive externality mostly will be in terms of this diagram, where there is a very, very large positive consumption externality. Okay, waiting for your next question. How will they test factor immobility and adverse selection? If I am not wrong, your school is not testing immobility and adverse selection. I'm assuming, Richard, you are TMJC. Yeah? So if you're TMJC, then I don't think they'll be testing this. But if you're not TMJC, then factor immobility, right? Basically, has two versions. You have geographical and occupational. So in order to explain this, what you need is an event that leads to structural change. So structural change then will cause new jobs to be created and old jobs to be destroyed. So workers in some industry who lost their jobs simply need to move to the new industries to take on the job. But if they are, for whatever reason, unable to move to the new industry due to occupational or geographical immobility, then this leads to productive inefficiency. Now, how will they test? The way they test is they will test as a Part A essay question that asks you very point blank, right? Explain how immobility of factors of production can cause market failure. However, this will never be a 10-mark question because too short already. So immobility of factors will be a 5-mark portion of a 10-mark Part A, and the second 5-mark will be a second market failure. Can be anything, can be externalities, can be public goods, right? Then adverse selection is the same. Adverse selection is a subset of asymmetric information, and it can also be tested as a 5-mark portion of the essay, not a 10-mark, not enough for 10 marks. So for example, 2024, I believe, 2024, the exam question, or 24 or 25, I remember, I think it's last year, 2025, they asked students to explain how adverse selection and moral hazard can cause market failure. So 5 marks for adverse selection, 5 marks for moral hazard, both of which come under adverse asymmetric information. So the way they can test this will be typically through a Part A essay. Now, of course, they can also test in Part B to ask you policies to deal with factor immobility and adverse selection. So usually, if it's 2 problems in Part A, then there will be 2 policies, 1 for each. So policy 1 to address 1 problem, policy 2 to address the other problem. So that will be how they can test this. If any part of this answer that I'm giving is you didn't understand, or I'm going too fast, you want me to repeat, please just ask. Waiting for your next question. Can you explain legislation in more detail? So let's put in the context of legislation using the same example earlier, right? Legislation in terms of, let's say, vaccine, right? So a positive externality in terms of vaccines, then the government legislate by making it compulsory. Then the government you don't really need to draw a graph for legislation. You just simply say that the government makes it compulsory for the good to be consumed so that everybody will consume vaccination. So this will, in theory, right, get rid of all, enjoy the maximum external benefits that vaccinations can bring about for the society. Then, however, you can give an antithesis to talk. So, very descriptive answer rather than graphical. Then, antithesis, you can talk about how making compulsory, right? We have challenges in terms of, let's say, enforcement capability. How do you enforce that everybody takes the vaccine? What about people, right, who maybe have allergic reactions to the vaccines? And if people were to develop medical issues related to vaccines, or let worse, touch wood, people die from the vaccine, right? Then there will be a lot of consequences and accountability issues, right? Then is it right for the government to be able to impose as a compulsory thing for people to be vaccinated? And what if they die from the vaccine? So these are issues that are very real world that you can consider, but that will be a rather descriptive answer anyway. Now, you can also apply legislation onto goods that have negative externality. Like, for example, vaping, for instance, right, is a good that is expected to have some significant negative externality. And some governments, like Singapore government, have chosen to not to tax vaping, but to make it illegal, right? So legislation to outlaw the use of vapes. So then this it makes vaping a crime, and in theory, supposed to eradicate. Probably doesn't work 100% because there are enforcement challenges and enforcement difficulties. So then this would be, again, a rather descriptive answer for legislation. Okay, I'm going to continue with Isabel first before I go to Natasha's question. Can I just make up my own law in legislation, or does it have to be an actual one? No, it does not have to be an actual one per se. You can make up your own, but generally, right, it will be easier to use existing laws, but don't necessarily have to be Singapore. Right? You can have laws that have been adopted in other countries. You can actually propose that. Yeah, so making up your own can be a little bit risky if it's not a well thought through law. So I would personally recommend you don't invent your own legislation. Use something that you know that other countries have done. All right. So going back to Natasha's question, do we need to have other prerequisite knowledge outside these chapters? For market failure, generally no. For market failure is you just need to know the content of each chapter. The only other thing you probably want to have is examples, right? Of good or different various examples of goods that have positive externality, negative externality, and examples of policies that can be used to address the various types of externalities. In terms of conceptual knowledge, is very much just marginalist principle: private benefit, private cost, social benefit, social cost. Is it like ABSD kind of policy? ABSD, right, is actually a tax rather than legislation per se. So it's a imposition of a new tax, because additional buyer's stamp duty, right? The word D, the letter D stands for duty, is a form of tax. So ABSD is classified as a direct tax. So when people buy homes in Singapore, if this is your first home as a local, then you don't need to incur ABSD. But if you already own one property and you buy a second property, then you have additional buyer stamp duty. So stamp duty is your tax. Buyer stamp duty means levied on the buyer, so it's a direct tax. So that's a tax rather than a legislation. So what would be a legislation? For example, right? LTV ratios, right? LTV limits. LTV stands for loan to valuation. So if the government says, right, for your first home that you buy, your loan to valuation limit is 80%. Means that you are allowed to borrow money from a bank to buy a house up to 80% value of the purchase price of the house at maximum. But if you wish to buy a second home, then the government may lower the LTV limit to a lower level. I don't know what's the current value. Maybe it's, okay, let's assume for simplicity is 60%. Then your second home, right? If let's say your second home that you wish to buy is a $1 million home, then you can only borrow $600,000. Then the buyer of the home who is buying a second home have to cough up cash up front, right, of $400,000. That effectively lower your ability to buy the goods, since not many people have 400,000 sitting around to pay for the house, right? So this is an example of legislation. So this would be an example of a legislation. So ABSD is not, LTV would be, right? So another thing that you could consider is the TSDR. TDSR, sorry, not TSDR. TDSR will be the total debt servicing ratio. This basically is a legislation that limits how much money a person is allowed to borrow from a financial institution in Singapore based on your monthly income level and how much existing loans you currently have with any bank. So that is not a tax, it is just a rule that sets the maximum allowed people can borrow. So there are actually two layers of limits, right? There's an LTV limit and there's also a TSDR limit. So if you want to find out more, can go and just Google about this TSDR. But I don't think they're going to test about this because this is not externality issues. Right, so your externality more will be like indirect subsidy, indirect tax. You can use public campaigns in terms of moral suasion to convince people to be more mindful to society, right? So that will be, and then third one is legislation. So public campaigns, taxes and subsidies, legislation are your three most standard arguments. What does equitable outcome mean and what's an example? So if you look at the syllabus document, right, equity refers to fairness in the distribution of uh, economic resources, fairness in distribution of essential goods and services. So for example, right, if let's say what we classify as essential goods and services could be in terms of, let's say, access to water, right, access to clean water, access to housing, access to healthcare, access to education. If we leave all these markets that produce essential goods and services like food, water, electricity, public transportation, telecommunication, education, and housing, if we leave it in the hands of the free market, then the prices determined by free market may be so high that low-income households cannot gain access to these essential goods and services. So, for example, if education was run purely based on market forces, then low-income households may not be able to afford at the market price sufficient amount of education for their children compared to higher income households. Then this can cause different access to differences in ability to access education, which then perpetuate income inequality across generations. So the next generation in a poorer family, right, will be disadvantaged. So you are losing out in terms of your ability to have a equal footing, equal opportunity, equal chance of doing well in doing well economically, right? So equitable outcome, right, can come from providing people with equal opportunities. However, to solve the problem, right, of inequity, there are two approaches. The first approach, right, is to provide people with equality in terms of the opportunities. The other approach, right, is to try to make the outcome less unequal through redistribution. Like, for example, if a person is poor and cannot buy enough of basic essential services, by giving the low-income households cash subsidies, put dollars into their hands so that they can buy more essential goods and services, then that is called redistribution, trying to make the outcome more equal. But by giving people greater access to education, healthcare, transportation, we are empowering people to perhaps do better, to be able to become more successful economically. So there are two approaches. Now, they're not mutually exclusive, definitely. You can do both, right? So in countries like in many European countries, right, while they do have policies aimed at providing better opportunities or more relatively equal opportunities, they also have a very strong emphasis on redistribution. Whereas a country like Singapore, right, while we also do redistribution, the emphasis in Singapore is more focused on providing people with equal opportunities. So if I were to quote our President Taman, right, so some time ago, there was an interview where a foreign interviewer was asking our then Deputy Prime Minister and current President. The question was, does the Singapore government not believe in the concept of a safety net? So they're asking that question in the context of how Singapore government seem to have relatively less social safety nets than, let's say, Western European countries. Then our President Taman's answer was that Singapore, well, he says Singapore believes in the concept of a trampoline, right? That we are not trying just to catch people who are doing poorly and make sure that they don't fall too low, but we are trying very much to empower people to bounce back, right, and become more successful. So I think I'm not trying to judge which approach is better, but I'm trying to highlight to you that Singapore's approach and the Western Europeans' approach are not different, but leaning more towards empowering rather than catching people who have fallen through the cracks, right? Whereas European side tend to place a little bit more emphasis on catching people falling through the cracks compared to Singapore side. Right, so which one is better, which one is worse, or up to you to decide. I'm kind of happy with the way we have. Okay, so that's what equitable outcome can mean. So in terms of fairness in distribution of essential goods and services, or at least that's how the syllabus define. All right, next. Are there some policies you have to know for this test? Assuming, right, Natasha, that they are really only testing externalities, right? Then just public campaign, taxes and subsidies, legislation, right? These are the three classes of policy. Okay, there is one more. There's one more policy, but this form. So the three main classes of policy for externalities. So for positive externality versus negative externality. So the first class of policy is called public campaigns. So public campaigns is applicable to both positive and negative externality. Then you have incentivization. This will be using subsidies and taxes respectively, and you can have legislation. So legislation can be, so by the way, our subsidies include direct provision. Because direct provision is to basically have the government provide the good for free. So legislation can be making compulsory. In terms of goods with negative externality, the government can use ban or quotas, right, or certain rules, right. Now then, for negative externality, got a special class, right, that doesn't apply for positive. The special class, right, is policies aimed at reducing MEC. Okay, this one is rather interesting, so I'm going to spend a little time talking about this. Policies aimed at reducing MEC. This only applies to negative externality, not for positive externality. So let's look at an example. So example is, let's say, traffic congestion. So traffic congestion, MPC, or car usage. So this is amount of car usage, benefits and costs. So assuming there are no external benefits of driving cars, only private benefits, then QP is higher than QS, resulting in a deadweight loss of this area. So this is traffic congestion. Now, what if, right, the government of a country solution is to build more roads, right, or widen roads? When you widen roads, right, then the same amount of cars driving on the road that is now wider, right, will slow traffic down by less. So if they slow traffic down by less, the marginal external cost becomes smaller. So MSC, MSC is equals to MPC plus MEC. If you can somehow make this smaller, then you are bringing the MSC closer to the MPC. So instead of QP increasing, QP falling to QS, is QS rising to QP, then your dead weight loss become a smaller amount. So this would be an example of how the government of a country can reduce negative externality by targeting the external cost. So other than this example of traffic congestion, you can also consider things like airports. Airports create negative externality in terms of noise pollution. So by locating airports further out from the city center at the outskirts area, there is a lower population density in the outskirts area. There are fewer people to experience the noise pollution, then your MEC decreases. That will be another example. Or smoking rooms in airports, for example, where you have dedicated smoking rooms for smokers to smoke, then they don't have to create negative externality onto third parties by isolating them in a particular place where there's, I don't know, air filters where they can smoke without affecting non-smokers. Then you are actually reducing MEC without actually reducing the economic activity. Yeah, so that will be the only extra policy. But other than that, right, if your school only tests externality, then these are the three classes of policies that you need to learn only. So public campaigns, incentivization through taxes and subsidies, and legislation. What is the difference between explaining subsidies for market failure and explaining from DDSS point of view? Okay, very good question. Explaining from DDSS point of view, right, you're just trying to explain how the subsidy changes the outcome in the market, right? How the subsidy causes the quantity to increase and the price to fall. So in terms of market effects, in explaining subsidy effect of subsidies on market failure, right? You're trying to, let's say, for example, explain the subsidy, how it addresses under consumption due to positive externality. Then what you want to do, right, is to explain the concept called internalizing the externality. Right, so you want to bring in the idea called internalizing the externality. Because positive externality, right, has MPV lower than MSP, so you have an external benefit called MEV. The private consumer will only take into account my private cost and my private benefit to consume up to QP. However, right, social benefit and social costs tell us that the social optimum is higher. So this leads to underconsumption and a dead weight loss equals to this area. So what does a subsidy do? Now watch the graph. If the government gives a subsidy, so a subsidy lowers the MPC to consumer. So it shifts, assuming the subsidy is set correctly, the MPC shifts down by the right amount. Then we move from this blue color point to the black color point. QP rises to QP prime, right? Then this corrects the market failure. But why does it work? The consumer, being a rational economic agent, right, will not take into account any external benefit to third party. That's why I consume at the blue color QP. So how does the government then make me change my behavior? By trying to either convince me using public campaigns to care about society, or failing which, the government can give me a subsidy equal to the marginal external benefit, right? If the marginal external benefit is $2, then the government gives me $2 of subsidy that lowers my cost by exactly $2. That changes my decision, that maximize my self-interest at the black color QP prime. Then what the government has done, right, is to measure the external benefit which I didn't take into account and plant that information of $2 into my decision-making process by using a subsidy as a vehicle, right, to move the information of $2 MEV into my decision-making process. So from external to my decision to now internalizing in my decision-making. So what you're trying to explain is how a subsidy can force information about external cost of benefit, in this case, subsidy, external benefit into the private decision of a consumer. Then similarly for tax, if there's external cost, then a tax measured equals to external cost can be a vehicle to internalize the information about externality into the private decision making of consumers. So that's the key difference in terms of meaning, right? So, but graphically, we just demand supply curve just draw the shift in supply and show the outcome in the market. But for market failure, we are trying to show how we get from private optimum to a new private optimum that is equal to the social optimum. So from QP to a new QP that is equal to QS. That is the essence of how we use subsidies or taxes, right, to correct market failure, different from DDSS. All right. Waiting for your next question. Anyway, your test is on Tuesday, right? If tomorrow got any question, can still always text me and ask. I'll be happy to help you with it. How? Any more questions? How can floor and ceiling come out? For your test, I doubt it can. I doubt they can test price floor and price ceiling because price floor and price ceiling, right, normally is to deal with price fluctuations, right? So that one will be less of a market failure issue in terms of inefficiency and also certainly nothing to do with externality. So price floor and price ceiling is unlikely to be tested, or actually not say unlikely. I don't think it can be tested under externalities. Wait, let me think. I guess if it's a policy question, if you say that, oh, a good is under consumed because it's too expensive rather than subsidy, the government use a price ceiling to prevent the price from rising. Yes, technically that's possible, but not usually a good solution. So for externalities, I wouldn't suggest use price ceiling and price floor at all. More price in price floor more for price stability and usually tested in a case study question rather than essay. Now, any other questions you have? Okay, I take it that we have no more urgent questions, right? Because there's only left 2 people on the live now, so most of the people have logged off. So I'm going to take it that there's no urgent questions that you want to ask. Then I'm going to end the stream now. But if you've got any further questions, please feel free to text me via WhatsApp, and I will actually follow up with your questions from there. Okay, so nothing else, then good luck for your upcoming WA on Tuesday. Okay, good night.